Morning, good afternoon, and welcome to episode 7 of the Beware the Day podcast. My name is Ryan. Thank you for joining me today. As I state every week, there's over 5 million podcasts in the podcast universe, 70 million listeners, and I'm happy that you chose this one today. Today, we're going to talk about the struggle for equality as it relates to housing and education. As always, I want to thank Black El Paso Voice for giving me this platform. I want to encourage you to subscribe and follow me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Apple, iHeart, and Spotify. And if you want to donate, simply follow the links on the screen. And if you want more information about boosting your business's profitability, if you're looking for affordable healthcare solutions and or you simply want to start a journey to generational wealth, please visit my Facebook page, KRC Companies LLC. So before we dive into today's topic, I want to spotlight a prominent figure in Black history, someone that you may or may not have heard of. Now, I appreciate the work done by Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, George Washington Carver. Those are household names. I want to focus on people that are not as well known to us as a people and to the public as a whole. And his name is Vivian Theodore Thomas. Vivian Theodore Thomas was an American laboratory supervisor who in the 1940s developed a procedure used to treat blue baby syndrome. He was the assistant to a surgeon named Alfred Blaylock in Blaylock's experimental animal laboratory at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and he later followed Dr. Blaylock to the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Thomas was unique in that he did not have any professional education or experience in a research laboratory. However, he served as a supervisor of surgical laboratories at Johns Hopkins for 35 years. In 1976, Johns Hopkins awarded him an honorary doctorate and named him an instructor of surgery for the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. So how was he able to accomplish this without any formal college education? He did graduate from high school. He attended Pearl High School in Nashville in the 1920s and graduated in 1929. He was born in Lake Providence, Louisiana. He was born during the Jim Crow era to William Maceo Thomas and the former Mary Alice Eaton. He rose above poverty without any education past high school, rose above poverty and racism to become a cardiac surgery pioneer and a teacher of operative techniques to many of the country's most prominent surgeons. His father was a carpenter and took pleasure in passing down his expertise to his sons. Thomas worked with his father and brothers every day after school and on Saturdays doing jobs such as measuring, sawing, and nailing. This experience proved beneficial to Thomas as he was able to secure a carpentry job at Fisk University, repairing facility damages after graduating from high school. He had hoped to attend college and become a doctor, but the Great Depression derailed his plans. He lost his life savings when his bank in Nashville failed in 1929. So he was forced to put his educational plans on hold. He managed to secure a job at Vanderbilt in February of 1930 as a surgical research assistant with Dr. Alfred Blaylock. On his first day of work, Thomas assisted Blaylock with a surgical experiment on a dog. So at the end of Thomas's first day, Blaylock told Thomas they would do another experiment the next morning. Blaylock told Thomas to quote, come in and put the animal to sleep and get it set up. Within a few weeks, Thomas was starting surgery on his own. Thomas struggled with finances despite saving most of what he earned. The salaries that he received did not provide enough comfort for him to quit his laboratory research job and go back to school. He lost his life savings when the bank in Nashville failed in 1929. Now, at Vanderbilt, Thomas was classified and paid as a janitor, despite the fact that by the mid-1930s, he was doing the work of a postdoctoral researcher in the lab. He abandoned his plans for college and medical school, relieved to have even a low-paying job as the Great Depression deepened. Thomas continued working with Blaylock and saving his earnings so that he could provide for his daughters and wife as best he could. Thomas and Blaylock did groundbreaking research into the causes of hemorrhagic and traumatic shock. This work later evolved into research on crush syndrome and saved the lives of thousands of soldiers on the battlefields of World War II. Blaylock and Thomas began experimental work in vascular and cardiac surgery, defying medical taboos against operating on the heart. It was this work that laid the foundation for the revolutionary life-saving surgery they were to perform at Johns Hopkins a decade later. So Vivian Thomas spent 11 years at Vanderbilt with Blaylock before moving to Johns Hopkins. Now, unfortunately, Thomas did not receive a lot of the credit that he was due. See, the way it worked out, Blaylock would do the surgery and Thomas would look over his shoulder. So, unfortunately, Thomas was never mentioned in any medical journals. He wasn't asked to pose for any pictures with any of the other surgeons. So he received no mention whatsoever. Dr. Blaylock failed to recognize the contributions that Thomas had made in the world-famous blue baby procedure, which led to a rift in their relationship. Thomas was absent from official articles about the procedure, as well as in team pictures that included all of the doctors involved in the procedure. Thomas remained at Johns Hopkins for 15 more years after Dr. Blaylock's death in 1964 in his role as Director of Surgical Research Laboratories. Now, keep in mind, no formal education after high school. This is incredible. He mentored a number of African-American lab assistants, as well as Hopkins' first Black cardiac resident, Dr. Levi Watkins Jr., whom Thomas assisted with his groundbreaking work in the use of the automatic implantable defibrillator. Thomas was presented with an honorary doctorate in 1976 from Johns Hopkins, but due to certain restrictions, he received an honorary Doctor of Laws rather than a medical doctorate. But it did allow the staff and students to call him doctor. On July 1st of 1976, Thomas was appointed to the faculty as instructor of surgery. Thomas served in that capacity for 3 years and retired in 1979. Vivian Thomas died of pancreatic cancer on November 26, 1985. A PBS documentary entitled Partners of the Heart was broadcast in 2003 on PBS's American Experience. In the 2004 HBO movie, Something the Lord Made, based on Katie McCabe's National Magazine Award-winning Washingtonian article of the same title, Vivian Thomas was portrayed by Mos Def. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Vivian Thomas. So now let's move on to our topic for today. We want to quickly recap what we covered last week. We talked about the post-World War II GI Bill. While the post-World War II GI Bill was written and passed with the best of intentions, we learned that provisions of the post-World War II GI Bill were administered locally. And that meant for African-American veterans in the South, it meant that a disproportionate number of African-American veterans in the South did not receive any benefits at all. So if you want to review that, I encourage you to go back and watch last week's episode. So today we're going to talk about the struggle for equality, housing, and education. This week we're going to focus on housing, and then next week we'll pick it up and we'll talk about education. Now, decades of housing discrimination have wiped out billions of dollars in generational wealth for African Americans. The current generation will lose an estimated $92 billion in home equity, and the next generation will lose an estimated $93 billion. Now, what forces in America brought this about? Well, the first one was the passage of the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act that was passed in 1956 and signed into law by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. This law opened the construction of the interstate highway system in the 1950s and 1960s. Unfortunately, construction of the interstate highway system displaced Black residents across the country. The highway system destroyed many urban neighborhoods, often isolating communities of color and those with lower incomes from surrounding communities and economic opportunity. According to estimates by the U.S. Department of Transportation, more than 475,000 households and more than 1 million people were displaced nationwide because of the federal roadway construction. Highways cut through neighborhoods, darkened and disrupted the pedestrian landscape, worsened air quality, and torpedoed property values. Communities lost churches, green space, and whole swaths of homes. They also lost small businesses that provided jobs and kept money circulating locally. Crucial middle-class footholds in areas already struggling from racist zoning policies, disinvestment, and white flight. The neighborhoods destroyed and families uprooted by highway projects were largely Black and poor, wrote New York University's law professor Deborah Archer in her article, White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes, Advancing Racial Equality Through Highway Reconstruction. And that was by design, she noted. Policymakers and planners saw highway construction as a convenient way to raise neighborhoods considered undesirable or blighted. And they deployed the massive infrastructure elements, multi-lane roadbeds, concrete walls, ramps, and overpasses as tools of segregation, physical buffers to isolate communities of color. Hardly a major city with significant minority population went unscathed by this legislation. New York, Miami, Chicago, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Oakland, Nashville, Baltimore, Atlanta, and many more. By the time the interstate highway system was completed, Archer wrote, it had fundamentally restructured urban America. One of the most influential post-World War II urban planners was New York City's construction coordinator, Robert Moses, who oversaw all public works projects in the nation's largest metropolis, including an astonishing array of its roadways, bridges, tunnels, housing projects, and parks. And he said, quote, our categorical imperative is action to clear the slums, Moses said in a 1959 speech. He said, quote, we can't let minorities dictate that this century-old chore will be put off another generation or finally abandoned, unquote. Moses, who was also the chairman of the New York City Slum Clearance Committee, said that the highway construction must, quote, go right through cities and not around them, unquote. The 1956 Federal Highway Act ran with this strategy, offering to pay 90% of the cost of states' new roadways with the caveat that they consent to building them through every major city to connect the emerging suburbs to downtown centers where commuters worked and shopped. In the first half of the 20th century, Miami's culturally vibrant Black community of Overtown was widely considered the Harlem of the South and Little Broadway. But after the passage of the 1956 highway bill, the expansion of I-95 through Miami led to the destruction of 87 acres of housing and commercial property in the community. According to Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, over 8,000 of an estimated population of 40,000 remained in Overtown after the highway expansion. Blocked from moving into white neighborhoods, displaced residents were forced to crowd into nearby sections of the city, already struggling with poverty, overcrowding, and urban decay. Cities around the country expressed similar devastation. Shortly after the highway bill, the construction of a vast roadway system cut through the Black neighborhood of Rondo in St. Paul, Minnesota, a mixed-class community known for its thriving cultural life, social clubs, and integrated schools. Despite neighborhood resistance, an estimated 600 families lost their homes and 300 businesses were shuttered when I-94 divided the community. Quote, "It wasn't just physical. It ripped a culture. It ripped who we were," said Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. "It was an indiscriminate act that said this community doesn't matter. This convenient place to put a highway so we can cross over this place and go from city out to the suburbs." At the time the highways were being built, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Congress and federal courts began to outlaw racist housing tactics, such as restrictive housing covenants that prevented Black residents from buying into white neighborhoods, and redlining, a long-standing governmental zoning practice that had denied federally insured home loans to anyone living in a designated Black community. As anxiety rose about the prospect of integrated neighborhoods, highway construction offered a solution: substantial physical barriers that could be used to reinforce racially determined neighborhood boundaries. Now, housing laws that banned racial discrimination in private housing were passed in 22 states by 1966. So we're going to talk about some of the things that the federal government did to stem the tide of housing discrimination. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in housing financed with federal subsidies. However, only 20% of new housing in 1963 had such federal assistance. Less than 4% of housing was covered by the federal discrimination ban. Less than 4%. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was more comprehensive, banning discrimination in home sales and rentals, covering over 80% of all U.S. housing. However, redlining, which is the practice of denying credit to people who are otherwise qualified for loans based on where they live, continued, and there was no enforcement of laws banning discrimination by realtors, banks, and zoning boards. Redlining dates back to the 1930s, when lenders would draw red lines on maps around neighborhoods that were predominantly Black as a way to deny mortgages. The practice was intended to reduce tender risk, but it actually institutionalized racial bias. Redlining can include the systematic denial of services such as mortgages, insurance loans, and other financial services. An investigation by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights revealed the FHA's collaboration with blockbusters and unscrupulous real estate speculators who sold substandard housing to African Americans and profited from the foreclosures when their properties deteriorated. The Department of Housing and Urban Development set criteria for loan risk that basically redlined urban neighborhoods, making them ineligible for federally subsidized loans and driving property values downward. Federal mortgage insurance programs were exempt from anti-discrimination laws under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. After the uprisings in the 1960s, experienced builders pulled out of inner city development. The FHA turned to dishonest and inexperienced developers who created substandard housing units. People who bought them could not afford to maintain them and defaulted in large numbers. Federal housing provided generous subsidies for suburban housing development, but only limited, segregated, thanks to redlining, and severely underfunded public housing for African Americans and the working poor. And just this week, I found an article where these private equity companies, also known as hedge funds, are buying up single-family homes in major cities in the United States. And yes, a disproportionate number of these homes once belonged to African Americans, or they still belong to African Americans. See, the way the game is played, when hard times come, these people cannot pay their bills, they go into foreclosure. And here comes these big private equity companies seeking to purchase homes in vast numbers, and they become rentals. So you know it's coming next. Typically, whatever they're charging in rent was probably more than what these people could afford in terms of a mortgage. So those people are forced out, and other people come in and rent those homes. So a lot of what I just talked about in terms of housing discrimination, it continues to this day, but in a different form. So I hope you all learned some things today. As I said, we're going to talk about education next week. So that'll be part 2 of our discussion. I want to thank once again Black El Paso Voice. Make sure you stay tuned to this platform and catch Suite 915 with Curtis and Fedora and Real Talk with Marcus McCoy. And please support the podcast by visiting the links on the screen. And remember, Black History Month is from January 1st through December 31st. This concludes our broadcast for today. Thank you for tuning in. You all take care, and we'll see you next time.